That joke isn't funny anymore. Available on Amazon and everywhere. Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez Podcast. I'm your host, Lou Perez, and it's been a little while since we've done one of these. I've had the summertime chills. I don't even know if that's what you would call it, where I'm doing way too much chilling come summertime. But in this new one back, I'm very happy to be joined by ter Maat. He is he's running for the candidate for Libertarian Party presidential nominee. Mike, thank you for joining me. You are actually the first presidential nominee.
Joy to be with you.
Yeah, you're the first presidential nominee of any presidency that I've had on the podcast. So thanks.
Well, in the summer, because you've been chilling. I have not been chilling in the summer. I've been busy, so I'm glad to spend a little time with you today.
Thank you. Yeah. What's the process been like? Running for to be president of the LP. I mean, how does that? Well, not president of the LP, president of the United States via the Libertarian Party.
The nominee of the LP. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. It's a lot of work and a lot of fun. So in that sense, it's a good process. The Libertarian Party has an open convention. We have a convention in May of the presidential cycle year. So in that sense, it's not all that different from what the Republicans and the Democrats do that a lot of your viewers will be more familiar with. But it's an open convention, which is to say the delegates are not pre-pledged to one candidate or another. So we have 900 or 1,000 delegates there. And so the process is you spend the year or two preceding that going around to the various conventions and other Libertarian Party events and introducing yourself to the delegates and letting them know what kind of campaign you will run on the other side of the nomination in the general election cycle, and a little bit about yourself and your philosophy. And people will choose who they think will be the best representative for the party. And I have, as you might imagine, some pretty strong views on this. And so I give the party a good choice, I believe, to represent the party.
Have you always been a libertarian, or like capital L libertarian, part of the party, or did you dabble in other political?
I did
parties?
dabble, as a matter of fact, more than dabble, and most members of the Libertarian Party were at some point in their wayward lives members of other parties. I grew up as a Republican. I was in the banking industry for a number of years in the 80s and then the early 90s. I went to graduate school as an economist in a very free market, open market environment. I was very lucky in that sense. I was an economist for the White House for a couple of years and for other international agencies. I had my own business.
Under who? Yeah, and who were you?
I worked for the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. I was a civil servant, so he was my boss's 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 boss. So it wasn't like he was calling me into the Oval Office to say, Mike, what should we do today? That wasn't it. But I was a civil servant in the Office of Management and Budget. And that was a good experience for a young conservative economist. Remember, he was the president who famously said, read my lips, no new taxes. And when he went back on that pledge and agreed to not only new taxes, but new spending, that was a real deflating moment for a young economist. And I did spend some years in and out of the Republican Party during the 90s after that. But it was in the late 90s that a buddy of mine said, you're a libertarian. And I said, I don't say mean things to you. Why would you say such a horrible thing to me? And it proved to be true. I was introduced to the Libertarian Party because I was not all that keen on participating in the culture wars. I'm personally socially conservative, but I don't believe that the way that we feel about the how society should develop is the kind of thing that should be legislated. It's not the kind of thing the government should be involved in. And so I found myself eventually registering as a libertarian.
Wow. Well, when did I switch my party? So when I was in New York, some time back when I used to live in New York, I registered as a Democrat as like kind of a joke. And I was like, look, I've been pissing off my my liberal friends so much. Here, I want to piss off my my friends on the right. And my friends on the right didn't care. Like no one gave a shit. I have good friends on the left.
Well, that's
and the
too
right.
bad because I love pissing off friends. It sounds like you pissed off some of them, so good for you.
Yeah. All the right ones. I think I pissed off. But then when I moved to New Jersey, one of the things you have to do, obviously, you have to go to the DMV and you have to get a new license. And it was such a long, painful, stereotypical experience.
Oh my goodness! Yes.
We made an appointment. We got there early for the appointment, and then I think it was like 2 or 3 hours later, my wife and I we were finally
New Jerseyans.
seen. Yeah, and when you get up to that booth, you're able to select which political party you want to join, and it was like right there. It was like an invitation. It's like, okay, after this experience, I think it's time to join the LP and to make it official.
Boy. And that is kind of a strange thing, isn't it? That you're there to, first of all, it's strange that you get a driver's license from the state. I think that's just weird naturally. But then that they ask you your political affiliation, it's like the state, my affiliation, and cars. Somehow these three things have come together in this weird way. So I appreciate your awkward experience. I had a New Jersey driver's license myself for a brief period. I lived in Morristown.
Oh, okay.
In like, I want to say 85, 86, 87 in there for a couple of years.
The legend of Mike ter Maat, it still haunts Morristown, New Jersey. Like that. I don't know if you can go back. I don't know if you can ever go back, but so, I think, one of the things is, you hear about, the Libertarian Party. It's that it's the biggest third, it's the biggest third party,
Yeah, by far. It's a lot smaller than the big two, but a lot bigger than whatever is in fourth place.
Right. So I'm wondering, like what do you think that you can accomplish through the Libertarian Party as opposed to, one of the two major parties?
I think a lot. I think that Americans are ready. Polling data show, for example, that Americans are ready for a third party, open to the idea because of a lot of things, including frustration with the Republican Party and frustration with the Democratic Party. And I think most people understand why that is. It's a combination of several things. Those parties have left behind their ideologies that they used to represent a generation ago. You don't really find many Republicans who are actually fiscally conservative anymore. You don't really find Democrats that are in a fundamental sense socially liberal anymore. If you're a member of the Democratic Party, you must fall into line. And if you don't, your obligation seems to be to go around canceling each other. The Democratic Party, nor the Republican Party, they don't seem all that interested in standing up for the First Amendment. They don't seem to want the government out of the idea of censorship. And both parties seem wholly on board with projecting military power around the world and spending whatever money it takes to do that. So in that sense, I think a lot of people are frustrated with the parties no longer representing what it is that they thought that they represented. Certainly, if you were an anti-war Democrat 40 years ago, right? I think that's as long as you'd have to go back to find a real anti-war Democrat. That party has left you. And similarly on the Republican side, if you were a fiscal conservative. So I think that the Libertarian Party is well poised to play a major role in American politics next year. There's a huge opportunity, not to mention the fact that the leadership of each of those parties is a little weird. To say the least. Yeah, I'm trying to be nice. It's a family show here, Lou, so I'm trying to be nice about it, but that's a little strange. So I do believe that Americans are open to an anti-war message. They're open to fiscal conservatism, and they're open to actual social liberalism in the sense that Americans have a libertarian streak that leans toward us being tolerant of each other, not only in a political sense, but in a social sense. And I think that Americans want to be represented by policies that reflect their values. Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of Americans are frustrated by the fact that the simple dignity of being able to raise your kids the way you want to seems to be slipping away from them. So we're the party that represents school choice and parental involvement and driving what it is that school boards do with their children during the day. We're the party that represents a foreign policy that reflects your values in a non-aggressive sense. So I believe that our party is the party that needs to fight our way back toward the Constitution, that needs to fight our way toward a set of policies that reflects American values. And I think that Americans are open to that.
Yeah, I sort of look at, the Libertarian Party as, while it, obviously, like you said, it's not as big as the other two parties. There's also a strength in that you get to be a little bit more radical. You get to say things that, point out what the two parties have so much, in common. I remember they used to say, you would hear this a lot. It's like, oh, what is a libertarian? A libertarian is a Republican who smokes weed. And then I saw it online. I saw it online. It's like, no, what is a Democrat? A Democrat is a Republican that smokes weed, which I think is a lot more in line than makes a lot more sense if you sort of look around. One thing I wanted to ask you about, because you brought up, not wanting to fight like these culture wars, and I guess it's a little tough not to fight culture wars when the government itself is currently waging what seems like culture war. So how do you have to get into that fight first before retreating or declaring a victory?
I think where libertarians draw the line on the culture wars is when it touches public policy, right? So I'm a big believer, for example, I'm a big believer in the idea of separating science from the state. We have a long history in the United States. Americans, I think, naturally buy into the idea of separation of church and state. It's one of the founding principles, indeed, why people moved to this continent, why our nation was put together, why our Constitution exists, is to protect your right to worship any way you want, or not at all, without influence from your government. And I believe that we need to honor our First Amendment in the same vein with regard to science. Pardon me. I think that Americans are open to the idea that we need to pursue our lives any way that we want to, and that the government's interpretation of science, the government's interpretation of how you should live your life, what you should do with your body, I think that we recognize that as just fundamentally inappropriate. The idea, however you feel about these issues. So, for example, however you feel about drugs, that doesn't mean the government ought to have the right to tell you you have to take a vaccine, or you can't use marijuana, or you can't use some other drug. However you feel about the issue, that it's just inappropriate. And I think that we have learned that the government is just not good at understanding these issues. It's not good at disseminating information. It's not good at separating itself from weird interests, big pharma in some cases, as we learned with the vaccines, government officials push sometimes some pretty weird ideas, and we'd be better off as a society, both in terms of social development and economics, and in making decisions for ourselves, if the government would stay out of it. That's just one example, but I think you get my point.
Yeah, and I think I think libertarians have positioned are in a really good position, as you said earlier, and just look at technologically speaking, the amount of the amount of reach that these ideas have now versus 20 40 years ago. And during the pandemic, during the lockdowns, it was great that the loudest voices that I was able to hear were often from the libertarian side, the ANCAP side.
That's right.
And it was so important that those messages were getting out. And you're talking about like the First
and
Amendment.
Not enough, arguably not enough.
Oh yeah, no, and now I mean, just with the revelations with the Twitter files, and then the what's happening now with the I don't know, the unraveling of Facebook, and I guess the term is jawboning, where the state will put pressure on a private actors to take down, to censor stuff. It's pretty astonishing, the lengths. Well, it's not astonishing, but the lengths that the government will go to censor important information.
I think you're right. I think it is astonishing in the sense that we had all believed that the government would not do that. If you went back a generation ago, I think the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of us, believed that the government would not go so far. And while it is true that a generation ago a number of government officials would, it seems now just accepted modus operandi. There are just no government officials on either side who are willing to throw themselves on the tracks in front of that train. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, it really just seems to mean that you want the type of censorship or the type of government regulation that drives the culture war in a certain direction. It's not a matter of, well, the government shouldn't be involved in the culture wars at all. You don't see very many people from either of the Republican or Democratic parties saying that. So I agree with you. I think it is astonishing. I think that the parties have merged together in this sense. And I think that libertarians, remember, Lou, libertarians, we are the philosophical descendants of the people that put together the Constitution, that put together this nation, and did so for the singularly legitimate purpose of protecting your liberty, protecting your rights. So I think that is up to us to fight for those liberties, to fight for your right to say whatever you want without being censored, for you to live your life by your own standards. If you're waiting for a Republican to lead that fight, I think you're waiting for something that's not going to happen. I would say the same thing on the Democratic side. So in that sense, I think that Americans are ready for our message and ready for a campaign like the one that we are waging right now.
Something that I found too with the Libertarian Party is its willingness to for a coalition building. And I've seen that. Were you at Pork Fest up in New Hampshire?
Yes, I was at Pork Fest. And to your point, our campaign was one of the sponsors of the Libertarian Party sponsored Rage Against War, the Rage Against the War Machine rally in Washington some months ago. That was another coalition building effort. And I will be participating in an anti-war rally at the United Nations this coming weekend, August 6th, which is an effort among a coalition of 20 different organizations. So, yeah, to your point, libertarians are all about single issue coalitions to help get the message out.
Yeah, because I up at Pork Fest, RFK Jr. Gave a talk. Vivek, I always blank on his last name. He's also
Ramaswamy.
He was up there too, and it was interesting to see. There so much about RFK Jr. that's just not libertarian,
right.
And yet the libertarians were at least welcoming a conversation there. I mean, I personally think that what libertarians like so much about RFK Jr. is that the possibility of him, somehow bringing down the Democratic Party, and I think it's that kind of, that little bit of chaos or demolition that I think a lot of libertarians are into.
I agree with you there. Anyone who's willing to run up against Joe Biden inside the Democratic Party is going to get a look from a lot of people, including libertarians. And of course, a lot of the libertarians like the fact that he stands up against the government machinery that wanted to shove the vaccine down our throat. So a lot of people appreciate that very much. Where there's a difference between most libertarians and RFK Jr. in any number of areas, I think that he fundamentally is a good government kind of guy. I think he means well, but he is not a shrink the government kind of guy. He's a fellow who believes that you can make the government work better. So I think that he spends a lot of effort talking about how to stop corporations from capturing the regulatory process so that it can work better, so the government can do a better job of knuckling under corporate America to work the way that he would want it to. And that, of course, is, I believe, a completely inefficient way to run an economy, to have the government dictating what corporations ought to do, which is fundamentally where he is. He's a bit of a statist. I do think he means well. And of course, the other thing about Robert Kennedy Jr. that is a little bit different from most libertarians is that he is not merely anti-mandate as far as the vaccines go, but he's truly, I believe, anti-vaccine, whereas a libertarian would tell you, you do you. You know, if you love the vaccine, go knock yourself out. Have 12 of them. We want the government to be out of the science of telling us whether the vaccines are a good idea or not. Whereas he, I think, just fundamentally believes that, the vaccines are a bad idea. And that's a bit of a difference.
And when we talk about vaccines, are we talking specifically about the
the COVID
Pfizer regime? Yeah. Okay, yeah. Got it. Yeah, because I'm not a fan of rubella. So I'm very happy that
there you go as an example, right?
Yeah, not a fan of not a fan of that one. One of the interesting things at PorcFest, it was a little bit of a controversy, is that RFK Jr. had requested, at least when he spoke in the what was, I guess, essentially like a big barn, that nobody in the audience be armed. And if anybody's ever been to New Hampshire, let alone PorcFest, I guess the way to describe PorcFest is like, just imagine like a bunch of hippies with sidearms, just guns on the, guns on their sides,
or in my case, short hair and wearing it on your ankle. But yes, everyone is going to be carrying all over the place, and I get it. With his family history, I understand the paranoia, but he's going to have to wake up and realize that the world is actually safer when people are allowed to carry when they want to. Yeah.
So on the so you were carrying on your ankle. Were you open carrying on the ankle or concealed?
No, I like to carry concealed. I find it. I've had bad experiences carrying openly. Let's put it that way. I was a police officer for 11 and a half years until about 18 months ago. It was my second career in public policy and public service. And so there were many occasions when I would carry open, wearing, for example, a training uniform as a police officer. And that was sometimes mistaken for not being a police officer, carrying open, which at the time in Florida, of course, was illegal. And that would cause problems. And I also noticed it made people uncomfortable. And so rather than prompting anyone I bumped into to call 911, which happened more than once, I learned to carry concealed, and I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah, I support, open carry, concealed carry. But I think, from like a safety point, I am surprised that I haven't heard more of incidents of people open carrying being confronted by people concealed carrying, because like there was an incident, I forget how long ago, but basically like this guy decided to he was, I think, open carrying his rifle either outside of a school or near like a school bus stop or something like that, and people would take pictures and and report him. And I believe, he was within his legal rights to open carry.
Right.
But I'm
Right.
just thinking as a parent whose, kids will be going to school one day, if I saw
It might make you nervous.
Yeah, it might make it nervous, or perhaps even confrontational. And so
I think our society will get used to open carry over time. I just think that as a cultural matter, we have not yet returned to a day, perhaps like a couple of 100 years ago, when it would not have been so unusual to open carry. So I think that we will get there. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, I have every respect for those who do open carry, because I think they're making a contribution toward getting society more comfortable with that. But yeah, I hear you. The mass shootings that we see at schools, occasionally a church or a club, they're so disturbing and so heavily covered by the media that it naturally causes concern when you are confronted by the imagery, by the sight of a weapon, and you have to think about it because we're not used to it. Mm-hmm. So I completely understand it. That's the reason that I carry concealed. It's also the reason, by the way, I carry concealed all the time. I don't like to be unarmed because you don't know, when that time will come. And I don't want to be that, retired cop who decided that day not to carry. And all of a sudden, that's the moment that you wish that that retired cop had been carrying. So I think that we'll get used to it over time.
Is it? It must be easier. I mean, as far as going state by state, it must be easier being a retired police officer, being able to carry, right? Is it something? Are you good in all 50 states? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, legally speaking, you mean?
Yeah.
Legally, I'm allowed to carry anywhere. Federal law says that if you were a police officer for at least 10 years, you can carry anywhere, notwithstanding what state laws say. Interestingly, as a libertarian, I've got a real problem with federal supremacy. I've got a problem with the federal government shoving laws down the throats of individual states. But as a libertarian, I do also believe that the states are misguided, both in a constitutional sense and as well as a liberty ethics sense in limiting our rights to carry a weapon. So you got a lot of that, juxtaposition going on. But I do believe that we have the right to carry, and I'm grateful that at least the state isn't telling me that I can't. And
how did you decide to get into law enforcement? Because it's obviously in anybody who's hung around libertarians enough, libertarians can come off as anti-cop. So how do you what inspired you to go the way that you went? So.
Well, I always wanted to be a police officer. The first time I took an exam for entrance was with the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan PD back in 89 or 90 when I was in grad school. And I just decided that I couldn't afford it. I wanted to raise a family. There were things that needed to be done. And I just didn't think that it made sense for me to become a police officer. So I stayed in school and developed a career as an economist, wound up teaching at 3 different universities and had a very rewarding career.
How old are you? Because
I am 111.
Because dude, you've lived quite a. You keep bringing up the 80s, and I'm like, holy shit, how old is Mike?
I'm 111. I'll tell you about the 50s later. No, I was born in 61.
Okay.
I am 62 years old, and so I was a professional economist for more than a couple of decades, if you include the commercial banking.
This is my way of saying you look great. You look great.
Well, bless your heart. I appreciate that. You look good too, by the way, Lou. But
I am not 62.
You've got the advantage of being younger.
I have no excuses.
So when I went into the police academy, I turned 49 in the police academy.
Oh wow.
Yeah, 50% of my class had at least one parent younger than I was. Put it that way.
Wow.
I worked as a cop from age 49 to 60 until about 20 months ago now. And that was a very rewarding experience. But as I was mentioning, when I first took the exam back in like 89 or 90 and just decided against it, in my head, I was really putting it off more than deciding against it. So I put it off. And then, fully 20 years later, you kind of realize if you put it off any longer, you're going to get past the point of no return.
Right.
So, I was very healthy at that age. I was very lucky. And so it was not physically difficult. There are a lot of transitions that are easier to make probably when you're younger than when you're older. But there are big advantages to becoming a police officer as you get older. You're less given to making certain types of mistakes that we're all frustrated with officers making. You have a greater appreciation for the balance of power. One of the things that I learned as a police officer is the enormous amount of discretion that officers have over the handling of any one particular case. And so you learn you are really, as an individual officer, the last wall against the encroachment of the government. You are the last individual who has a responsibility to stand up for someone's individual rights, not just against crime, which of course is a big reason why people become police officers, because they want to stand up for your protection against crime, but also against the state, that the state will force itself upon individuals were it not for, even worse, were it not for police officers limiting their own power, because in so many cases, you have enormous discretion about how things play out.
And were you a beat cop? Were you,
Yeah. I was on the road. I was on the road for all of the 11 and a half years. I was fortunate that the police department that I worked for, while not what you would call large at 100 officers, it was also not tiny. And so, we had a little bit of specialization inside of our department. For example, I didn't have to get involved with the war on drugs, which was a good thing for me because
it's pretty convenient for the libertarian cop.
Well, yeah, I mean, you say convenient, but it would have been a deal breaker. So in that sense, that was very, very fortunate for me. It actually created a situation when, that I could be an officer and be more or less comfortable about it. But it's a form of public service that I had always been interested in, and I found it a very rewarding experience. It is a tremendous amount of hard work. I have every respect for the men and women with whom I worked and who do the job elsewhere. And I should add that I was very lucky in the sense that I had a good police department. I think that police culture needs a tremendous amount of reform. I spent a lot of time talking about criminal justice reform and changing the way that we manage police officers. But the truth of the matter is that I was lucky that we did not have a lot of the cultural problems, at least certainly not to the extent that other departments have had. And I know that we're going the right direction, but we have a great deal of space yet to cover. We have a lot of gains yet to be made in terms of improving police culture.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm from New York originally, and I grew up. I know a lot of cops, and I think one of the issues that I have, I guess, with policing, at least when I was in New York, is the idea of serving and protect. To serve and protect, but I think it's very difficult to claim that you are protecting if, for example, you look at the gun laws in New York and it's like very much disarming the citizenry. It's sort of like, I think the first line of defense is self-defense and being able to do that. And
I agree.
So.
Yeah. And we've seen just in the last couple of years how much more difficult it has become, I think, more because of courts than because of changes in policing or changes in legislating. We've seen the courts go the wrong direction on protecting individuals' right to defend themselves. One of the things that you see as a police officer is that a lot of cops have a libertarian streak, just like a lot of Americans do. I found that most cops, at least the ones that I worked with, most were registered Republicans, but had a real libertarian streak in the sense that, a common frustration with the state. We all like to be frustrated with our boss, right? I mean, who doesn't love to complain about his boss once in a while? Well, when you're a cop, that takes the form of, oh, can you believe the dumb thing the legislature did, in our case in Tallahassee, the dumb thing that the legislature wants us to do now, or the dumb thing that the city wants us to do now. And so I think that cops naturally sort of bristle against the silly things that the state wants us to do. And the officers that I worked with were very much pro Second Amendment. That's not the case in a lot of police departments. Mm-hmm. And so, that was a good thing. I think it is a shame that police officers are asked to enforce a regulatory framework that intrudes upon our Second Amendment rights so far. It's really a horrible thing. It is obviously out of the control of police officers what the legislature decides is a crime, but there is some flexibility and there is an attitude change that matters, and there is local leadership that matters. Our city was run by a mayor and by a commission that I think could have done a better job, but at least wasn't as bad as it could have been.
And and with that, like the changes on a local level, you're running for the nomination for Libertarian Party presidential nominee. So that's going like right to the top. Do you ever think of like, oh, maybe I should start smaller, like in like small local, like local elections or something like that? What are your thoughts on that?
A lot of the issues that I have personally been involved in, plus my experience in Washington, suggest that I think that my voice makes the most sense at the federal level. Having said that, yeah, I do spend a lot of time talking about criminal justice reform because it's, in my experiential wheelhouse. And I also believe that a lot of that can be affected at the federal level. Number one, something I spend a lot of time talking about, is sunsetting the war on drugs. Number two, something else I spent a lot of time talking about, is replacing the federal doctrine, court-imposed doctrine of qualified immunity with a requirement that police officers carry their own liability insurance, like a medical doctor would, right? A malpractice policy, because I think that in the long run, we're going to be a lot better off when we use market forces to impose some accountability on the business of managing police officers. When that happens, we'll be in a much, much better place. I also think that getting an insurance company involved in providing liability insurance directly to the officer is going to create a third-party outside check on the system, in a way that local politicians have proven that they are either incapable or unwilling of providing themselves. I wish that local politicians would do a better job of aligning a police department's values with the values of the overall community. But too often, local politicians have demonstrated that they are just unable to pull that off, sometimes because of political capture. In our case, the police department was an important political force in the town, and I think the mayor just didn't want to ruffle feathers. And in many other cases, local politicians just believe that they're better off with broad statements like "back the blue" in all cases, which I think is a dumb position, or the alternative on the left side of defund the police. We're anti-cop, which I think is similarly unhelpful police reform is hard work, and I wish that local politicians would get involved with it.
When it comes to cops carrying insurance policies, I think it's really, really interesting. I just wonder, if you look around the country, like I've heard about bigger cities where more police are retiring, and there aren't enough new recruits coming in. So it's sort of how do you put something like that, like a policy like that, which I think on its on the surface seems like it would help. It would be a benefit overall for the citizens, but it might deter more people from actually wanting to become police. If it's like, oh shit, man, I gotta carry insurance and I might get sued if I do something.
Sure. Yeah, nobody wants to set up a situation where we're threatening that you're going to lose your house if you made a good faith error at work one day, right? That is not a system that can sustain itself. Anybody that wanted to do that job would be too dumb to hire. But I do believe in the long run, market forces will straighten this out. It does mean that you'll have to pay officers a little bit more money to make up for the cost of the insurance, but cities are going to save money in the sense that they won't be carrying the insurance themselves anymore, and that more cases will be off of the city's books or county books or state books and be on the insurance company's books. So there's not that much change in terms of how much money is involved. But to your point, it would be better off for citizens. I think that we would agree that the very idea that if you feel wronged, you can't seek redress in court, that's un-American. Even if you're not correct, but if you think you've been wronged, you deserve a right to have that adjudicated. And telling people, well, in the case of medical malpractice, we don't tell people, well, the doctor didn't mean to cut off the wrong toe, right? So suck it up, buttercup. That's not the way this works. You have a right to seek redress. And if you have a case, you have a case. And if you don't have a good case, you don't have a good case. But we want the courts to work correctly. And so in that sense, it's just un-American to keep the system the way that it is. In the long run, I believe that police officers will have to be paid a little bit more money to make up for the cost of insurance. I also believe that in the long run, you're going to want police officers to make more money. I think that you want a system that works more like other businesses, where the best officers get paid more, the mediocre officers get paid less, and the crappy ones get fired. And that's the way that we would expect any industry to work. And I think that it'll be to our benefit when unions finally lose the ability to impose a system whereby which everyone gets paid the same.
Yeah, and I think it's important too, just looking at the culture at large. So if you look at, take, for example, a place like San Francisco, where I believe they instituted a policy where, basically it allowed people to shoplift up to $950, right? So it's like, well, behind that policy is a lack of respect for property, right? Or the idea that, property even exists. And right. It's like, well, if that's one of your values, well, then you're just setting up a chaotic world, or, the idea that you're going to allow people to, assault one another and not, right. Have police get involved. So right. It's sort of like, one of the reasons why we got out of New York, my wife and I, we were living in Brooklyn, and I would just, hear these stories, especially about, on the subway, of just like these maniacs kind of doing whatever the hell they want. And what I was fearful for was, if my wife was riding the subway, especially with our child, right, that if she was ever attacked, for one, the police might not even be there. But even worse than that, the men on the subway car wouldn't step in to help her out. And I feel
They don't. No longer do most men, I believe. No longer do most men feel like the legal framework in which we swim would have your back.
Yeah, yeah, and you have I've seen, with so many incidents, happening in New York City in particular, where a go-to comment from the right is often like, "Well, you voted for this," and it's like, well, no. When I was living there, I actually didn't vote for that. I actually didn't.
Right.
Yeah, I actually believe in self-defense. I actually believe that if a man is threatening others or using force, that you can use force against that person.
Right. At some point, some people need to be punched in the face.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, as simple as that. Yeah.
It is unfortunately as simple as that. When there is a threat, and I believe that you have the right to carry, and if absolutely necessary, you have the right to brandish that. And if absolutely necessary, you have the right to use deadly force if you were confronted with such. There seems to be an underappreciation for just that point that you brought up, for your right to live safely and for your property to exist in a safe environment. And I think that there are communities that have, underappreciated your property rights and your rights to safety and the value that a police department can provide in that context. And at the same time have overvalued, overappreciated, in my view, the extent to which we should be labeling people who are in difficult difficult financial situations as victims of society, and therefore needed to be treated differently than anybody else. And I'm not a fan of labeling some class of people just because they're poor, even if it's a matter of them being homeless. We do not give them greater latitude in terms of committing crimes. I don't think that those dots connect. And I appreciate the fact that we don't want to over prosecute. I'm all about that. And so are other police officers. But it is not over prosecuting to say that shoplifting should remain illegal, should be prosecuted, ought to be stopped, and is the tip of the iceberg in terms of evil behavior that communities have a right to protect themselves from. And when your police department is working as it should, it plays a major role in preventing crime, even though it's not felonious, it's only misdemeanor crime. You want your police department to work hard at protecting your rights.
Yeah, I remember a while back I had Dr. Anthony Daniels on. His pen name is Theodore Dalrymple. So he writes a lot for like Tacky Magazine and City Journal. And for a while he worked as a psychiatrist in a prison in England. And one of the people that he was seeing was this woman who was in an abusive relationship where the boyfriend or husband or whatever would come home and beat the shit out of her. And he was talking to her and she's like, well, he's under a lot of pressure and sometimes he can't control himself and, all this. And then he asked her this very simple question. He's like, well, would he hit you if I was in the room? And she said, no, he wouldn't. And it's like, well, there you go. It's sort of, these incentives there. It's like, you can get away with a lot of this shit if you're not being checked on it. And right. I just want to tell you one short story about while I have you here. So I'm from New York, originally born in Queens, went to college at NYU, lived in the city for most of my life.
Right.
And something that I used to notice on the subways in particular is that the maniacs would become maniacs at a certain stop. So there's sort of like these certain these borders within the city where it's like, okay, you're kind of in what we would call the ghetto. You're not a maniac there. But then once you hit the more cosmopolitan region where it's, mostly like white people, whatever, then you become a maniac and start doing, all the shit. And the idea, the understanding was, okay, this sort of behavior, this maniac behavior isn't going to fly in your neighborhood, but it will fly, downtown,
in a different place.
In a different place. So my wife was pregnant with our first son, and we were taking the subway to see her doctor. And then on the way back, we were, sort of at that border point. My wife was sitting down, and then one of these guys gets on. I think he had just, had a visit at the methadone clinic, probably on 125th Street in Manhattan. And he sits down like next to my wife, and I'm standing in front of him on the subway. And this guy, we hit that demarcation line where you're allowed to be a maniac. He pulls out a plastic bag, and he pulls out a lighter, and he attempts to light his plastic bag on fire, which the purpose of that, I don't know what the purpose of that is, but once he pulled out that lighter and had his finger on it, I grabbed his hand and I spoke to him in Spanish, which he wasn't expecting. And I said to him in Spanish, "My wife is pregnant." And I said it to him so there was no uncertainty that, dude, you keep fucking around, I'm gonna fucking murder you right now. And he was very.
There is no extent to which I won't go to protect my family. Yeah. That's the signal.
And he got it. And he stopped being that piece of shit, right? And now I feel like, in my experience on the subway, since that day, over the years, these people aren't being checked on that, whether it's by police or by the fellow strap hangers, and they go and they do this really, they take part in bonkers behavior and make living life terrible for people. And there's something about what I would like to push too with when it comes to libertarians, talking about personal stories, I think is really important. Then also just talking about I think there's a personal dignity to the philosophy of libertarianism, where it's very much like, no, I'm not going to put up with this because I have self-respect. And I'm willing to, I want others to have self-respect too, and dignity in their lives.
Right.
So.
Right. And a respect for our neighbors.
Sure.
Our neighbors, as a police officer, one thing you learn is that it's your job to protect the rights of people who hate your guts. We need to do a better job of aligning, in my view, we need to do a much better job of aligning the principles by which your police department works, the principles by which it is run, with the underlying values, ethics, morals of the community. That is not to say that we are going to let off the hook the political leaders in the community from doing their job, which is to correctly understand the ethics and values and interests of their community. If you were telling your police department, either go too far in one direction or go too far the other, that's on you. If you're telling your police department, stand down with regard to any misdemeanor crime, right? We're just not going to prosecute those. That's on you. That's a problem, right? That is misusing the tool that your police department can be and should be. And similarly, if you tell your police department, I want as close to a zero crime rate as possible, and I don't care what you do to achieve that, right? I want you to go around cracking heads and make sure everyone knows there's a new sheriff in town. Well, that's not aligning with your community's values either, and that's misusing that tool that police departments ought to be. And I think that all too often, political leaders are not leaders. They, misperceive their community's values, and then they end up trying to align themselves with some weird set of policy prescriptions on the left or on the right. And that's when things go off the rails. And we've seen them go off the rails in either one of those directions. So I think that we need to get back to the idea, as you put it, of not only self-respect, but respect for each other, respect for our communities. And I do not believe that you're showing respect for your police department when you're just not interested. I think that police reform is important. It's hard work, and that it is something that in the long run will serve the interests of police officers. I think that we need to hold police officers more accountable, both in terms of doing the right thing and in terms of not doing the wrong thing. In the long run, the business of policing, by the way, just like the business of teaching in public schools and in private schools, will be better when we find a way to get around police unions saying everyone's got to get paid the same, whether you do a good job or a crappy job, and get around the idea that our local politicians are not going to play a role in holding people accountable. We need to defeat both of those cultural problems. And I think that what they have in common is, like I say, local leaders not doing a good job, and public employee unions really throwing up roadblocks, and there not being enough competition. We need more competition for good police officers and good teachers. We need both of those groups of people to be evaluated on their merit, and for school districts and police departments to compete for the best employees. That'll drive up the wages of the good ones and make sure the bad ones wind up unemployed. So I'm a big believer in school choice, and I'm a big believer in the idea that we need our state laws changed so that local municipalities can replace not only individual officers more easily, but replace their entire police department if they need to. We need more competition for organizations to provide police services on a contractual basis. Where I worked, for the city that I worked for, they only had two choices. They could stick with the police department they had, for which I worked, or they could invite the sheriff's office in to provide police services. But those are really their only two choices. Mm-hmm. And I think that we need a situation where there's more competition.
Well, Mike, talking about competition, the Libertarian Party presidential nominees, you have some competition here in Mike ter Maat. So, Mike, thank you so much for joining me today. And wherever you are, I hope the weather is beautiful. So it's looking pretty good gorgeous. Out there right where I am.
Happy summer to you, Lou.
Summer chilling. Yeah.
I'm really proud of you for coming up with the idea of summer chilling. I think that is a marvelous juxtaposition. I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer.